Yesterday, I had an entire sermon about the disciples and Jesus walking on water in the midst of a storm. The whole sermon was about storms in our lives, tropical storms, COVID, challenging relationships, slavery, racism, the history of racism. It was all wrapped up in that sermon about storms until I realized that there really wasn't any storm in the gospel this morning. Only the winds against them on the boat. Don't ask me where that storm came from, other than the tropical one outside the windows of our homes last week, wreaking havoc, taking down trees and power lines as the winds blew through and the rains came down. As seafarers, Nanette and Paul can tell us that when a boat is headed directly into the wind, it's a rough and a difficult ride. Against the wind, the boat and disciples would have been battered and exhausted. Against the wind, it would have been hard to carry on. Why was life so difficult? Where was Jesus? Why did Jesus make them get into the boat and go ahead while he went to pray? Did he not care? Would they perish? I imagine all of us have had the experience of attempting to get somewhere when the winds were against us. The winds of nature, of creation, of humankind. Sometimes it can feel as if it's the Spirit of God. The very art of sailing, not that the disciples had a sailboat, is to capture the wind in your sails so that one moves smoothly and quickly across the surface of the water. It's to allow the force of the wind to move one forward. The disciples that night were stuck, far away from land and without a sail. They were battered, as their boat, when Jesus came walking towards them on the sea in the morning. This was terrifying too. As Jesus approached, he said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." What happens next is telling. Peter answers, "Lord, if it was you, command me to come to you on the water." Peter asks to be called. Jesus responds by saying, "Come." Peter, get out of the boat. And he begins walking, only to notice the strong wind, which is when he becomes frightened and begins to sink. Peter cries out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reaches out his hand and catches him. In this encounter is a call and response, a command that invites action, fear that is met with courage, and the presence of God and God's saving grace. The notion of having to get out of our boats is one that I have been pondering for some time. Even a boat that has been battered by the winds, to trust God that it will be okay, to trust that we can do this. What are the boats that are being battered by the winds of the world? The one from which we are being called for things to change. Or maybe the question is when? When do we get out? And from what boat? It feels that one boat has been the home where we have been sheltered for the past 5 months during this pandemic. When was the last time that we spent so much time in one place? It's scary out there too. Or maybe it's a relationship or a job. Maybe it's the way that we've always done things, or our temptation to hang with only people like us. Perhaps it's a mindset or an attitude. The boat in our gospel story, battered by the winds, was not an ideal place to be. But for Peter to respond to Jesus' call, he had to have the courage to act and then to ask for help. The wind that night was beyond the control of the disciples. Their only choice was how to respond. For instance, Joseph in the Old Testament story had seemingly no choice when he was thrown into the pit and sold into slavery by his brothers. There was no stepping out of his boat. This can be true for us when we find ourselves battered by forces beyond control, or occasionally of our own making. However, Joseph makes the strategic decision not to give up. Perhaps we are being called out of the boat, back into the world, back into community, back into ministry with one another. In New York, public health data indicates that it's possible to do, to leave the safety of our boats, our homes, to gather and to receive communion at church, to gather with friends with appropriate social distance and a mask for a meal together, to open our minds to safe ways to work together, or possibly sending our children back to school. Leaving the comfort of being with and among people only like us, whoever we might be, to welcome inclusion, diversity, equity, leaving behind that what limits us from moving forward into the unknown, trusting God and not being afraid, even when it might be scary. I say all of this, of course, with appropriate precautions for the COVID-19. I imagine that all of us have stories about discovering God when we have felt the winds of change. While I could tell my own stories, the most powerful stories of faith that I have heard have been by immigrants and refugees and my African siblings. In my life, it has been immigrants and refugees who I know that have left everything with hope and the dream that this country, the United States, would provide opportunities for them and for their families that did not exist elsewhere. A place where they could be safe from violence and with a means of economic support. To do so, many left their homes, their families, their countries, their boats, to experience new life. Often in their stories are experiences of Jesus in the midst of it all and the challenges of life. This collective story is very different than my African siblings in this country, for whom many of their ancestors were stolen and sold into slavery like Joseph. The boat they found themselves in were slave ships, where they were inhumanely chained and beaten and killed. The ones who escaped the boats often died. But their courage to get out of the boat, to call on God, to not be afraid, to know that God was with and is with them, is a story that continues to teach and inspire us and to encourage us to trust in God. I will acknowledge that when there is a sail, there is something quite exhilarating and inspiring when the wind is harnessed in such a way that one is propelled forward with ease, direction, and speed, and with a calm and a full heart. Likewise, in our story, Peter and Jesus returned to the boat after stepping out, after doubting, and after growing in faith. We are told that the waters were calm on their return and for their journey forward. Perhaps it's not about quieting the wind, but discerning how and where God is calling us and taking that step. Do not be afraid. Take heart. It is I. I am with you. Amen.